The Woolworth Building at 233 Broadway in Lower Manhattan was completed in 1913 at a cost of approximately $13.5 million, funded entirely without debt by Frank Woolworth from the profits of his five-and-dime retail chain. It was the tallest building in the world from its completion until 1930, when the Chrysler Building, documented in Case File 022, surpassed it. Cass Gilbert designed it in the Gothic revival style that Frank Woolworth had specifically requested, producing what Gilbert called the Cathedral of Commerce, a building whose architectural vocabulary borrowed explicitly from the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe and applied it to American commercial ambition, with a confidence that treated the two as not merely comparable but equivalent. The building was fully leased to corporate tenants at its opening and remained one of the most commercially successful office buildings in Lower Manhattan for the first half of the 20th century, serving as the headquarters address for companies whose presence at 233 Broadway was itself a statement about their institutional standing. The second half of the 20th century documented a different story: the migration of corporate headquarters from Lower Manhattan to Midtown, which began in the 1950s and accelerated through the 1970s, progressively reduced the pool of potential tenants for whom a Lower Manhattan office address represented the institutional credibility that 233 Broadway had historically conveyed. By the late 20th century, the Woolworth Building had lost the corporate anchor tenants whose presence had defined its commercial identity, and its ownership was managing the building through a combination of government agency tenants, smaller professional services firms, and the revenue generated by the building's recognition as an architectural landmark. The forensic entry point for this case is the conversion thesis that the building's current ownership has been executing since 2012. The transformation of the upper floors of the world's former tallest building from commercial office space into luxury residential condominiums, a conversion whose execution challenges document the specific complications of adapting a century-old Gothic revival skyscraper to contemporary residential standards. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Woolworth Building's commercial trajectory from the 1970s onward reflected the specific dynamics of Lower Manhattan's office market in the decades following the geographic shift of corporate headquarters to Midtown that had progressively reduced the district's relevance as a premium office address. The building's ownership by the Woolworth Corporation had become an anachronism by the 1990s, as the retail company that Frank Woolworth had built was itself in the final stages of a competitive decline documented in its own financial record. Woolworth Corporation rebranded as Foot Locker in 1997, having already sold the Woolworth Building in 1998 to the Witkoff Group. The sale of the Woolworth Building by its founding company's successor produced the specific disconnection that Case File 033 documented in the Sears Tower context. The building outlasted the company that built it, continued to bear the name of a company that had ceased to exist in its original form, and continued to be visited and photographed by tourists whose interest in the building was historical and architectural rather than commercial. The covenant that the Woolworth Building's successive office market strategy had not read carefully enough was the one written into the geographic logic of Lower Manhattan's office market development. The World Trade Center complex, which opened in the early 1970s and added millions of square feet of Class A office space to Lower Manhattan's inventory, redirected corporate office demand to a newer and larger product at the southern end of the district, progressively reducing the demand for the Woolworth Building's older, smaller floor plates among the financial services and legal tenants who were the primary drivers of Lower Manhattan office absorption. The September 11th attacks, while not directly damaging the Woolworth Building, further disrupted the Lower Manhattan office market and accelerated the geographic reassessment of Lower Manhattan as a corporate address that some tenants had been conducting throughout the 1990s. By the early 2000s, the Woolworth Building's occupancy profile had shifted from the corporate anchor tenants of its first half-century to a mix of government agencies, smaller professional services firms, and the institutional tenants whose lease terms and rent sensitivity differed materially from the corporate profile that the building's economics had been designed to serve. At what point does a landmark office building's departure from its original tenant profile create an irreversible trajectory toward an alternative use? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The conversion thesis that the Woolworth Building's current ownership, the Alchemy Properties group that acquired the upper floors in 2012, has been executing represents one of the most architecturally ambitious residential conversion projects in the history of New York real estate. The conversion involves the transformation of the building's upper 34 floors, from the 31st to the 67th, into approximately 34 luxury residential condominiums, whose pricing at the time of marketing reflected the specific premium that a combination of Gothic revival architecture, world record historical significance, and lower Manhattan panoramic views was projected to command in the New York luxury residential market. The appraisal methodology that governed the conversion's financial thesis treated the Woolworth Building's architectural and historical significance as generating a premium above comparable luxury residential offerings that would justify the conversion costs that adapting a 1913 commercial building to 21st century residential standards requires. Those conversion costs are substantially higher than the equivalent costs for a purpose-built residential tower, because the Woolworth Building systems, its floor plates, its elevator banks, and its mechanical infrastructure were designed for commercial occupancy in a pre-war era and require comprehensive replacement and upgrading to meet the residential standards that luxury condominium buyers in the contemporary New York market require. The appraisal had to price the premium that the architectural and historical significance generates against the premium conversion cost that the building's commercial to residential transformation required, and determine whether the net spread between the two was sufficient to justify the investment. The conversion has proceeded at a pace that reflects both the genuine demand for the product at premium pricing among the specific buyer demographic that the Woolworth Building's unique characteristics attract, and the execution challenges of adapting a Gothic revival cathedral-scaled commercial building to residential use in a lower Manhattan market that the post-September 11th recovery and the post-pandemic reassessment of lower Manhattan as a residential neighborhood have made more competitive than its mid-20th century office market trajectory had suggested it would become. The conversion is ongoing. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The institutional history of the Woolworth Building across its century of existence documents the specific challenge of managing a building whose architectural and historical significance creates expectations of institutional permanence that the commercial real estate market is not obligated to fulfill. Frank Woolworth built the Cathedral of Commerce with the intention of creating a permanent institutional monument to the commercial achievement that the five and dime retail format had made possible. The building was completed without debt, funded from the profits of a business that Woolworth had built from a single store in 1879 to a retail chain with hundreds of locations and annual revenue that made him one of the wealthiest men in the United States. The building's architectural ambition, the Gothic revival language applied to a 67-story commercial tower, was the physical expression of Woolworth's conviction that the commercial achievement it commemorated was as significant as the religious and civic achievements that Gothic architecture had historically been used to honor. The Woolworth Corporation's eventual exit from the building, its rebranding as Foot Locker, and its departure from the retail format that Frank Woolworth had built, represents one of the most complete examples in American corporate history of a founding institution's departure from the physical monument that its success had created. The building persists. The company whose name it carries ceased to exist in the form that justified the name in 1997. The institutional denial embedded in this specific trajectory is not located in any individual decision-maker's assessment of the building's commercial prospects. It is located in the fundamental premise of the Cathedral of Commerce itself. The conviction that commercial achievement is as permanent as the Gothic cathedrals it emulates. The cathedrals were built for institutions whose claims to permanence were theological rather than commercial. The commercial claims to permanence that the Woolworth Building expressed have been progressively revised by the market conditions that its century of existence has produced. The Gothic spire is still there. The 5 and dime stores are gone. The condominium buyers who will occupy the building's upper floors will live in apartments whose architectural inheritance is the conviction of a retailer that his commercial achievement was as permanent as a cathedral. The Woolworth Building's residential conversion is producing one of the most distinctive luxury residential offerings in Lower Manhattan, with units that combine the Gothic Revival architectural details of Cass Gilbert's original design with contemporary residential finishes and the panoramic views of New York Harbor, the Hudson River, and Lower Manhattan that the building's height and its position at the southern end of the island's commercial core make possible. The residential market for which the conversion is targeted is the specific demographic of luxury buyers for whom architectural and historical significance represents a premium rather than a complication, and whose preference for a singular residential address in a building with a documented history of cultural and architectural importance exceeds their preference for the amenity packages and uniform finishes that purpose-built luxury residential towers typically provide. What the Woolworth Building case reveals in the context of this channel's 48-case archive is the specific trajectory from commercial institutional monument to luxury residential conversion that buildings of extraordinary architectural and historical significance in declining commercial districts have followed as the residential real estate market's appetite for distinctive historic spaces has developed as an alternative to the commercial uses that the buildings were designed to serve. The Woolworth Building is not unique in this trajectory. The Chrysler Building case documented in Case File 022 documents a building whose architectural significance has been consistently used to justify premium valuations that the commercial office market cannot consistently validate. The AT&T Building case documented in Case File 036 documents a building whose architectural significance generated acquisition premiums that successive corporate tenants eventually found incompatible with their operational requirements. The Woolworth Building's residential conversion represents a resolution that the Chrysler Building and the AT&T Building cases have not yet found. A use that matches the building's architectural significance to a market willing to pay the premium that significance commands, in a format that the building's physical characteristics can accommodate at a conversion cost that the premium can justify. The Cathedral of Commerce is becoming residential apartments. Frank Woolworth built it without debt. The residential buyers will likely acquire their units with mortgages. If this case file changed how you evaluate the trajectory from historic commercial monument to luxury residential conversion in landmark skyscrapers, subscribe, because the next case examines a commercial building whose trajectory has not yet resolved and whose resolution remains uncertain. And in the comments, given the Woolworth Building's conversion from commercial to luxury residential, what specific architectural or historical conditions most reliably generate the buyer premium that makes such conversions financially viable against the elevated conversion costs that pre-war commercial buildings require? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.